it really has to happen in small steps. And as the small steps occur and their lives get less and less stressful, then they're willing to implement more and more.
Welcome to the Kids Eating Broccoli podcast, where we believe that raising healthy kids shouldn't be complicated. Our mission is to inspire 20 million families worldwide to take the steps to raise the healthiest generation in our history. We'll interview some of the world's leading experts in nutrition, human potential, and children's health, as well as extraordinary chefs and foodies to gain insight into simple, fun, and creative ways to introduce natural health into homes across this planet. Hi there, welcome back to the Kids Eating Broccoli podcast. We're continuing on with our special series on ADD and ADHD for ADHD Awareness Month. Today's guest is Dr. Anik St Martin. Dr. Anik has been in practice with her husband for over 16 years in the Pacific Northwest, where she's an active speaker. Dr. Anik is pediatric focused and enjoys the family wellness focus of her life. Her passions include cooking, surfing, running, skiing, and mostly being with her husband and 2 boys. She's self-described as a dreamer who is energetic and naturally happy. She gets excited about anything to do with nutrition, outdoor adventure, and daily surf report. I asked Dr. Anik to join us today because of her special focus on kids and families, and especially helping kids and families of developmental disorders and ADD and ADHD. Today's interview got a little choppy because of technology, but totally worth it. So I hope you enjoy.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Anik, today with the Kids Eating Broccoli podcast. We appreciate you taking your time.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. So I'd love to just jump in and have you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got to where you are today with the work you're doing.
Sure. I've been in practice with my husband for 16 years here in the Northwest. And I think that, halfway through chiropractic school, I very much became aware of the fact that I wanted to work with kids a lot and parents, even though I didn't have a full understanding of what that meant or what it looked like. And then along the years, I've became hooked up basically with the ICPA and eventually got my diploma and realized that there are so many different directions to, throw oneself in when it comes to kids in chiropractic. And in the end, came out of it really feeling like I just like to work with families, that I don't necessarily want to specialize in one particular microcosm of the pediatric side of things, but I identify with most families and I get along with kids and babies better than I do most people. And so that's become a big portion of my practice. We have a large practice for doctors who work with us. And, my piece is very much just family-centered and being able to help people in the simplest way possible, where they can apply things for life, ideally, with their kids that are going to be effective and not overwhelming. Great.
Yeah, well, that's really why I wanted to have you on as a guest, because I think it's so valuable. We've had different guests who are, experts in the biochemistry of things or that type of stuff. Not to say you don't have expertise, but what I really like and appreciate, and I feel like it's so useful, is when we can have guests that can really give us, take home strategies and take home techniques and things we can actually put into place right away. Because I think as I'm a parent of young kids as well, we're always looking for, what we can do with, the 3 seconds we have to add something new into our daily routine, right?
Exactly.
So since you mentioned being in practice and for these years and working with families and young people, tell me just sort of in your experience, you must run into a lot of children, I imagine, who have been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD and that type of stuff. Do you have thoughts about that? I mean, have you seen that as something that's been increased over these years, or?
Absolutely. And it seems that, the diagnosis comes from all directions now, doesn't it? I mean, kids are being diagnosed at school. They're being diagnosed by their teachers, by their family members. It seems like a lot of kids walking in the door with an ADHD label haven't necessarily been diagnosed by anybody with the credentials necessarily to be diagnosing them as such. I think it's also important to realize that most ADHD diagnoses are that it's a misdiagnosis and that it should just be a sensory processing diagnosis generally. And I think if we can remember that mostly as chiropractors too, that when they walk in our office, it doesn't really matter if they've been diagnosed as ADHD or ADD or even as having autism. What they have is a difficulty adapting to the world they live in, right? And there are that applies to all of those kids, and it doesn't necessarily become hyper-focused, and it doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It does seem like that, I have a lot of parents that come into our office who, maybe they haven't even had their kid diagnosed, but they already think like, oh, if I took them somewhere, they would get that diagnosis. It seems so prevalent these days, really in the last few years, more so than I've seen in the past. So that was interesting what you're saying, that it's not, in a lot of cases, it's not really that, it's, some sort of sensory processing, situation. And so can you just say a little bit more about like what that difference is?
Well, I think that when we look at it as a sensory processing issue, again, we're talking about just a generalized challenge or disconnect between essentially the nervous system and adapting to the world around us. And that can come in different forms, right? You can then hyper focus it into, is it an auditory processing issue, or is it a texture issue? Is it a visual issue? And although those are really important to address and zone in on, I think that again, addressing specifically the nervous system by adjusting the children, but also really paying attention to their diet and the proper rest and proper hydration and the avoidance of certain things will make a blanket improvement across the masses. And so I don't think that anybody needs to be necessarily an expert, although that's helpful. But for a lot of parents, again, that's overwhelming. They don't really know, how to find the experts. I think if we were all pretty well versed, I'm just realizing that the nervous systems need to be better tuned into what's going on around them and better able to adapt to that. With a few simple tools, it can make a huge difference across the masses.
So one question I imagine some people might be wondering, in hearing that would be, what do things like our diet have to do with our nervous system or our brain, So could you say a little bit, because, that's something we hear about, like, oh, they might have this and they might have that, and you do these different things. And I know the medication route, are chemicals that directly affect, neurotransmitters in the brain and so forth. So could you just say a little bit about how it could be that things like dietary things or rest or some of those things affect our nervous system and our brain?
Absolutely, right? The nervous system wants to be in a state of ease as much as possible. And anytime that the nervous system finds itself under stress, whether it's because of a stressful diet or the stress of having, taking a certain medication. So in the United States, for example, we prescribe 5 times more Ritalin to our children than the entire rest of the planet combined. And we all know that, Ritalin is pretty much classified in the exact same substance category as cocaine. And so being able to help parents with a different approach in terms of not causing stress to the nervous system, but actually removing and supporting the nervous system becomes ideally a lifelong, potentially life-saving approach.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So let me ask you then, so a new family comes in to start being taken care of in your office, and in addition to the things you might do, in your office, where would you start if they were like, we don't know what to do, and they, eat sort of the standard American diet? Where do you think the first place is for those type of families to start making some changes are?
Well, one of the first things we go through if the child is in school, in public school, one of my first questions is, do they eat school lunch and school breakfast, right? because having kids in the public school system and being really sort of observant of the menus, I'm really aware, especially with breakfast, what the kids are eating. It's a lot of sugar. It's a lot of processed food. It's a lot of chocolate milk and Cocoa Puffs, essentially. And so if the answer to that is yes, then it becomes, how many days a week? And we really take a look at the menu together. I just pull it up right on the computer from where I'm adjusting the school board typical menu and how much sugar there is in that. And we talk about the recommended amount of sugar, ideally very, very limited, particularly for breakfast. And so we analyze that and we right away bring small tools in place, like the introduction of more protein. And ideally maybe introducing protein with these kids, a protein snack every 2 hours, even if it's tiny, will make a huge difference almost right away. And so I try to give them tools that they can implement the following morning without necessarily even having to go shopping. Something that they can readily access that will show them a difference almost right away. And once they see a little bit of a change and I'm developing a relationship with them, then they're more apt to ask questions and be receptive to learning new information. So then we might really talk about the idea of food colorings and the 9 different food colorings that are approved here in the United States and the impact, on the brain and particularly the impact on nervous systems that are potentially sensory challenged. And we take a look at the different types of foods that have food coloring, right? Like anything from cereals to fruit roll-ups to yogurts to hot dogs to candy, everything that's basically very much marketed to children. And so diet-wise, the first thing we look at is food coloring and sugar, and the idea of really trying to remove as much of the processed food sources as possible. And these are things that make sense to people, right? That makes sense to them. It's something they've always technically known, but they just need some reinforcement. And they need somebody to tell them it really does have an impact. And if you can remove these foods and introduce a high protein content, with the reduction of sugar, you will absolutely see some changes in your children's behavior. That makes sense to them.
So what, well, a couple of questions I guess came to mind. What would be the most common things people might be noticing with their kids so they can kind of be on the lookout if they start making these changes? What are the first sort of things you usually see changing?
Well, they might notice better ability to rest. And so a lot of these kids have a hard time winding down at night, especially. They might even be waking up in the middle of the night. A lot of parents will notice a change in sleep habits almost right away. They might also notice better reports from teachers. That's one of the first things that people will say is that, his teacher said he had a really good day today, And then parents will also notice maybe better interactions with siblings. Because a lot of these kids also, if they're not having particularly big troubles at school, it's almost like they can manage their emotions, they can manage their behavior really well when they're in public, and then when they're home with their families, all hell breaks loose, basically. They just kind of let it all go. They're comfortable, and siblings tend to really take the blunt of it. And so parents will often notice that sibling relationships will change almost right away.
Wow. Yeah, that's probably music to some parents' ears, hearing that for sure. And then you mentioned, a protein snack, quality or protein snack every couple of hours without even having to shop for something new. So what would be something like types of ideas you might give somebody if they're like, I don't know what that means? Absolutely.
We talk about eggs. A lot of kids like eggs, whether it's a hard-boiled egg or a quick scrambled egg after school or that sort of thing. A lot of the times these kids can be dairy sensitive, and so we might not talk about anything like cheeses or yogurts right away unless we have them specifically tested. Nut butters, if the child doesn't have a nut allergy, we talk about nut butters in their purest form, right? Not pre-mixed or smooth. What's the word I'm looking for? The type of nut butter that basically is pre-mixed. Obviously, then they're adding sugar and they're adding oil to that. So right. we have them try to look for the nut butters that have the oil on top. And we're that specific about it because most parents just aren't aware. they're buying, what's easiest. We talk about things like maybe trying some edamame. A lot of kids really love edamame beans, like in the shell, where parents can just sort of boil them real quick, put a little salt on them, and show the kids how to eat them. They're really high in protein. Talk about making smoothies and adding things like hemp seed. Hemp seeds are really high in protein. Smoothies are usually very kid-friendly. You can add a lot without the child even really knowing. Things like that.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. And so, oh, sorry, go ahead. Oh, I thought I interrupted you.
I think you just broke up for a second.
Oh, yeah, maybe so. Yeah, our connection's a little bit funny, but the audio tends to be fine. So, okay, so now a parent has started doing these things and, adding the protein in, starting to be aware of food colorings and things like that, and is starting to see some changes. What would be sort of the next level after that?
Absolutely. Supplementation, I think, is really important with these kids. And this is another place where I don't want to overwhelm parents. I don't want to give them a list of, 15 different things to implement, but there are a few that are necessary, in my opinion, to implement. The first being a really good multivitamin. The second, a child-friendly omega-3 fatty acid, keeping in mind that a lot of kids don't swallow supplements yet at that age, depending on which age they are, and that the chewable omega-3 fatty acids often taste like fish. And so I might have some specific recommendations for good liquid, even flax-based omega-3 fatty acids that are very plant-friendly. And then a probiotic and a digestive enzyme, the four that we start with. And that's pretty much across the board. I make sure that parents are either giving those to their children or implementing them into their bloodstream.
So definitely echoing some of certainly some of the other guests we've had with the omega-3s and so forth. I don't know that I've heard specifically for kids the digestive enzyme. What's the rationale with that one?
The rationale is that a lot of these kids may have food sensitivities that haven't been diagnosed or they haven't been properly tested. Maybe they've had a skin scratch test, which of course doesn't really test for the IgG portion of the allergy antigens. That's the delayed sensitivity, right, where it can take potentially up to 3 days for a reaction to occur. After you eat a certain food, and so if the kid's eating, for example, eggs, every day and they're egg sensitive, and it's contributing to some behavioral or digestive type stuff. The parent could get completely lost in trying to identify food connections because it takes 3 days for the actual reaction to occur. And so the digestive enzymes will really help, especially when you're using specific digestive enzymes, can help break down gluten and certain carbohydrates and certain proteins and just help the kids digest their foods, ideally while eliminating some of that inflammation in the gut, because the gut connection, again, is often very much there.
Right. So then are these supplements things that we would expect them to basically just take the rest of their lives?
Not necessarily, but I often tell parents, I often just don't give parents a specific amount of time because everybody's so different, right? You might have a child who comes in at age 7 having been on, 12 courses of antibiotics for recurrent ear infections, for example, or, chronic sinusitis or things like that. And so depending on what's gone on with the child's digestive system in the past, it may take a while. And I'm really honest with parents about that. It's not something that's going to, necessarily miraculously heal in a month. It could be a year. It could be 2 years. And so I usually will ask them to make it a 3-month commitment. And then 3 months later, we kind of reevaluate, see where we are. And most of the time, parents want to keep their children on those supplements. And so typically after a year, if somebody wants to start pulling back a little bit, I'll encourage them to do that. And parents are so in tune, especially, the ones who are willing to do all of these things for their kids are so in tune that they'll notice right away as they start pulling back on the supplements if it's too early.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. And so now we've, started reducing our artificial colors, cutting sugars out of the diet, adding protein and adding those supplements. What about, I imagine you must get some pushback about the sugar in our culture. I mean, I know I do in my office because, sugar is so prevalent in all of our celebrations. I mean, we're in October now. We're heading into the holiday season. And I think I've certainly had some parents who are overwhelmed by that possibility of like, how will I possibly keep my kid from eating sugar during the holidays? Do you have any specific tips or ideas about that one?
It's a really tough one, isn't it? From a parent's perspective, my oldest is a teenager, and I also get into this situation where I don't want to control every aspect of his life. I don't think I should. And so I often will make it a rule that, when we're home, we eat home cooked meals and there's no sugar in the house. When we're out, if you're out with your friends or at somebody else's house and somebody offers you something, go ahead, have what they're offering you if you want it, yet be really in tune with how you feel afterward. And so trying to empower the kids themselves to be intuitive, to implement some intuitive eating, because ultimately they're responsible for their own choices. And a lot of these kids they inherently know what they need to stay away from because they can feel it. They'll describe feelings of being out of control or feelings of anger. And I think if you can kind of connect the food connection for them with that and take that responsibility or part of it off of the parents' shoulders, then that helps a lot. That being said, of course, you've got candy canes floating around Christmas, and not only is it full of sugar, but it's full of red number 40. Trying to really empower parents to notice what happens and empower the kids to notice. And then around Christmas, what I really encourage people to do is maybe spend some time in the kitchen with their kids. There's so much absolutely great online access now to recipes that are kid-friendly, that are sugar-free, something like honey or some of the more natural sugars into some really good recipes, and empowering the kids to participate in making those. Kids become proud of what they make, and then they're more likely to try it, and then they're even more likely to share with their friends, and it becomes much more of a position of ownership for them. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's interesting what you're talking about too with your own teenager, kind of giving them the leeway or empowering them to notice how they feel. Because, I mean, if you really think about it, all the other animals on the planet, they already know what to eat, right? And so Exactly. Somewhere inside all of us, we have that ability. And not that, certainly there's a lot of reasons why we don't have a lot of contact with that as a culture, but to notice that and highlight that in our own children, I think is a powerful lesson just in life in general, let alone, their nutrition and eating.
Absolutely, sure. Because there'll come a point where we're not there,
Right.
And
right.
so I think empowering them to do that as early as possible. And then I think it's good because then they really feel like they aren't depending on us all the time to make their food choices. They can depend on themselves. And again, it becomes empowering and it becomes a matter of choice.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's very important for sure. And especially even in what you were saying about including them in the kitchen, it also becomes an important thing for them wanting to, eat the healthy foods, as if they're part of the whole decision-making process, cooking process and everything. So yeah, I think that's some great stuff.
Exactly.
For sure. So in implementing these things in your practice, either specific story or just sort of some general things, what are some of the things you see as people that you've worked with start making these changes?
Well, I think what I see is, a lot of the times I just saw a mom yesterday who, the parents come in and most of the time they're much more overwhelmed than they'll let on, essentially. And when they have a child who is having some behavior issues or some sensory integration issues, it can be really a big load on the family. And so my goal is to really have an impact on the family dynamic, because the moment you can relieve some of the stress on that family, then they start to see the possibilities. Their patience levels change. They can then have some hope. I mean, these families, a lot of the time, they're just at the end of their rope. And if you can give them just a little bit of a change, right? You implement the omega-3 fatty acid, you remove a bit of sugar, you remove some of their food coloring, and they see, fewer outbursts or, better performance in schools or better relationships with the siblings. Even if it's just so minute, for them, it can make a world of difference. And then they grab onto that, and then they're willing to make some major changes. Then we might talk about having kids food sensitivity tested and bringing in some proprioceptive training and some specific exercises and things where all of a sudden they're willing to take that extra step because they see the possibilities, whereas before they were just kind of, running into a wall basically with in terms of hope.
Yeah, well, that's really great. That's interesting too, what you're saying about having some small steps and then seeing the possibilities, because that can certainly be, a frustration that, those of us who work with these kids and these families can run into. I mean, I know I do, where it's like I have, this whole plan that could make such a difference, but it's like it seems like an unwillingness to try it. But I think that's really important, what you're saying about what's really going on in the family dynamic and how overwhelming it is, and how, to add one more thing on there is such a huge problem. And I really think that's part of, at least what I experience in terms of parents having their kids on the medications, even though, most know that they're powerful brain altering medications. But it's like, if everything is overwhelming and you can just give them a pill, even if you don't really want to, or you're worried about the side effects or concerned about that, it can take a load off in terms of, sort of relieving that pressure. And
exactly.
So
I think it's also important to remember that we need to meet people on their own reality, right? I mean, I take a look at, my family and what seems obvious to us, and things that we can't compromise in terms of our diet or our lifestyle, our philosophies, is definitely not, what most other people are doing. And so being able to meet people on the reality of the fact that maybe they're eating out 5 days a week, and giving them just a little bit of a change. Because if you come at them and you start talking about, say juicing and having home cooked meals 3 times a day, 7 days a week, and you'll lose them in terms of their attention span or even what they imagine to be possible in their minds, right? And so it really has to happen in small steps. And as the small steps occur and their lives get less and less stressful, then they're willing to implement more and more and more.
Right. That makes a lot of good sense, for sure. Excellent. So if anyone listening wanted to learn more about you or get in touch with you, or just learn more about some of what you're talking about, what would be the best place to do that? How would they do that?
They could email me directly at Anik, ANIK, at myadvantagechiro.com.
All right. And you said you're in the Pacific Northwest. Are you whereabouts?
I'm in Longview, small blue-collar town, about 40 miles north of Portland, Oregon, in Southwest Washington.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. There's a ton of useful stuff in this episode, so I really appreciate you, laying it out in a way that someone could take our conversation and really start implementing and be able to see some of those changes, right away.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much. It's very helpful. And especially, just in terms of what we were talking about last, with how overwhelming it can be. And so to be able to have a path, like a clear path laid out, or at least the beginning of it, is so helpful. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. You take care. If you enjoyed this episode of Kids Eating Broccoli podcast, connect with us online. You can find us on Facebook at Kids Eating Broccoli Podcast, or at Dr. Brad Ellisor DC. You can also go to our website, drellisor.com. That's DOCTORELLISOR.com. Go to iTunes and leave us a review and a rating, or on Stitcher. And be sure to keep in touch with us so you can hear the next episode. Sign up for our mailing list or like us on Facebook. You guys take care now, and let's make the next generation the best generation.